Hello everyone, and welcome to the ASBMR webinar, Journal Peer Review, Tips for Writing an Effective Evaluation. This is the second webinar in ASBMR's Publications webinar series, and we're so glad to have you all here with us. My name is Katie Duffy, and I'm the Director of Publications at ASBMR. Before we get started, I have a couple of quick announcements. During today's presentation, all participants will be in listen-only mode. If you have any questions during the presentation, use the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your screen. The questions will be answered either live during the webinar or at the end. The presentation portion of the webinar will last approximately 30 minutes, and the remaining 15 minutes will be used for other questions and answers. If you have any questions during the presentation, again, please use the chat feature to type your questions at any time. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Deborah Veis, MD, Ph.D., an Associate Editor of the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research since 2015. Dr. Veis is Professor of Medicine and Pathology at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, Missouri. She is Chair of the Advocacy and Science Policy Committee of the ASBMR and is a past counselor of the Society. She has served as a peer reviewer for Cell, Science, Journal of Clinical Investigation, Nature Medicine, Cell Metabolism, Cancer Cell, Developmental Cell, Journal of Biological Chemistry, Arthritis and Rheumatism, and others. Thank you to Dr. Veis for taking the time to share your advice on peer review evaluations with us today.
Thank you very much, Katie. Oh, there we go. So this webinar arose out of the overall editorial objectives for the JBMR journal, which includes focus on accepting only the best science, attracting more interdisciplinary science, strengthening the peer review process, increasing submissions of high-quality papers and acceptances from high-growth areas, as well as global expansion of the editorial reach. And as you can see, peer review is really central to many of these objectives. So today we're going to cover the following topics. I'm going to walk you through the editorial process for JBMR and the similar process for the sister journal, JBMR+. I will talk about decisions at the editorial level for triage and reviewer selection, our expectations for reviewers, how to construct a review, ethical issues that arise, the often difficult question of what recommendations should reviewers pick, and then how those reviews are interpreted by the editorial staff. And at the end, I will also talk a little bit about good titles, because those are important things that we really want the reviewers to pay attention to. And finally, recognition for service as a reviewer. So this slide shows the review workflow for JBMR. So once an author submits a manuscript, there are administrative checks that happen at the staff level, and then the paper goes to the editor-in-chief, now Dr. Roberto Civitelli. He then assigns both a deputy editor and associate editor. There are 3 deputy editors and about a dozen associate editors at JBMR. Then the editors determine if the manuscript meets standards and suitability for the journal, and if not, the paper may be triaged at this point. And from JBMR, there is often an offer of transfer to the JBMR Plus journal. If the paper is potentially suitable for the journal, then the associate editor invites reviewers, choosing several possible appropriate reviewers for the particular manuscript. Once those reviewers have accepted, generally at least two and possibly 3 reviewers, those reviewers evaluate the manuscript and make recommendations, which go back to the associate editor, then to the deputy editor, and then finally to the editor-in-chief, who makes the final decisions. If a paper is sent for either minor or major revision, then when the author does a resubmission, the paper goes directly back to the reviewers automatically, who then, again, make their recommendations, which go through, again, the associate and deputy editors, and finally to the editor-in-chief. This process is very much the same for JBMR Plus, although at the top left, the author's submission may come from the cascade from JBMR if the authors agree. So that would not be automatic. The authors have to decide to go ahead and send the paper to JBMR Plus. And then there is a different set of editorial editors at the JBMR Plus journal, but essentially the same process goes on. So the editor-in-chief assigns the deputy and associate editors, but does not decide himself whether the paper should be sent for review or not. That decision first sits with the associate editors. And so what do we do when we get a manuscript? One question is the overall topic of the paper appropriate for the journal? Occasionally we get papers that just don't really fit into the scope of our JBMR readership. Another question is, how much work is there? Is the paper too big, too small, not really, again, a good fit for what appears in JBMR? We also think about the expected impact on the field. Is this something that's going to make a strong impact, or maybe are only incremental findings at the periphery? And then we also make a superficial assessment of the quality of the science. So the first three things are often information that can be obtained from the abstract. The associate editors often scan the paper, but this is not a really detailed review, the same as we expect the reviewers to do. So typically, a very careful reading of the abstract and a look at the figures are really sufficient to make these main decisions. So if any of the above questions suggest the paper is not appropriate for JBMR, then the associate editor recommends triage. In most cases, we refer to JBMR Plus to allow them to then make a similar decision. After the associate editor sees it, the deputy editor reviews this decision, and if they agree, then the editor-in-chief decides. If they don't agree, then often there is an email exchange between the deputy and associate editors to come to a decision about whether the paper should go out for review. So in most cases, about 2/3 of the time, the papers are sent out for review. So how do we choose reviewers? When papers are submitted, the authors have the option of suggesting reviewers, and some people are very good about picking very appropriate people from their field, but not those with whom they directly work. But we do need to consider potential bias. We don't know who's good friends with who and may or may not be completely objective. So generally, we don't pick more than one of the suggested reviewers that are made by the authors. The Wiley website has a number of search features, including flags that identify editorial board members, as well as ASBMR member volunteer reviewers that have been solicited. So if you are on that list, we have a way to find you. Additionally, the journal search features include ways to find related papers, and then people who are in the system as JBMR authors and reviewers. And often if we see that someone has been a previous reviewer, it makes it more likely that we will choose them again because we can see how reliable they are, rather than completely unknown people. We can also do various keyword searches. But in addition to this, myself and I think many other associate editors use various online search tools like Google Scholar and PubMed to look for people who have particular expertise related to the topic of the manuscript. And then finally, an associate editor's personal network. Sometimes you see a paper and you say, I know exactly who would be a really good reviewer for this paper. I'm going to ask him or her. Also, once you are identified as a potential reviewer in the system, an email will go out, and you can see an example here at the top. These are generally, essentially a form letter. But if there's something different about this paper, there may be additional comments in here from the associate editor. For instance, if they've decided there's disagreement and there's a third reviewer being brought in late in the game, the associate editor may indicate that in this invitation. So you should at least glance at the first few sentences and make sure it's not exactly the same as every other one that you've gotten. Hopefully, you will feel that you are an appropriate reviewer for the paper and have time to do so and will say yes, but you should not agree to review if you're currently employed at the same institution as any of the authors, if you've been a recent mentor, mentee, or close collaborator with the authors, if the subject matter is outside of your area of expertise. Sometimes, we just pick wrong. Please do refuse those. And if you perceive any other conflict of interest. Also, if you cannot return the review within about 14 days, we would like you to turn it down. But if you really want to review a paper, you feel like it really is within your expertise, but you have something going on, you're going on vacation, you have a grant deadline, that sort of thing, but you only need an extra week or so, then let the associate editor know, and often we're very happy to accommodate that, especially if you're really a very appropriate reviewer for the manuscript. We are more interested in the quality of the review than in the exact turnaround time. So just to give you an idea of how the overall times work, once an associate editor gets the manuscript, we are expected to try to make the decision about review versus triage within 2 days. And also then, if it's going out for review, to make those invitations to reviewers. Then the reviewers have 14 days to do their review, and then it goes back to the associate editors, which again have 2 days to make this post-review decision. The deputy editors have a similar time period, and then it's going back to the editor-in-chief. So you can see there are a fair number of potential days in there, but JBMR is doing pretty well. If you include triage papers, which generally will be triaged within 4 to 5 days or maybe a week, the overall turnaround time to first decision through March of this year is 21 days. And if you exclude those triage papers, which have that very short 1 week turnaround time, overall the time to first decision is still under 1 month, so it's 27 days. And this really relies on our reviewers being timely in returning those reviews. In many cases, reviewers will do the review within a few days, which really helps us out in terms of keeping this turnaround time low. I think we all know as authors that we really appreciate a good quality review that's returned to us in a timely manner. JBMR Plus is still, I think, getting its sea legs as a new journal, and the turnaround time is a bit longer, but the expectations for reviewers are still the same. We're hoping for 14 days. The JBMR journals use a single blind peer review system, and this means that the author names are revealed to the reviewers, but the reviewer names are withheld from the authors. Reviewers do, however, have the option of disclosing their names in the narrative assessment to authors box if they desire to do so, although I have not really seen many people doing this. Another expectation of reviewers is that they maintain strict confidentiality. So you should not disclose that you're reviewing a paper to anyone except the editors and the Wiley editorial office staff. So this includes the authors themselves, if you have to see them at a meeting or a study section, etc., your colleagues who work around you, etc. You shouldn't disclose any information about the article prior to its publication. Manuscripts are embargoed. And you shouldn't share reviewer or editor comments to other parties, and you should not use this information in your own work until after it's published. In some cases, when you're reviewing a paper, you come across an issue that you know one of your colleagues would be really useful to help you figure out, for instance, what a figure means, or if the data is believable. If you want to consult with a colleague to enhance the quality of your review, we're not opposed to that, but we would prefer that you discuss it by email with the editor first. So you can let us know who you want to consult and what the issue is, and it's highly likely we'll say, great, go for it. Sometimes, though, I've found as a reviewer that you can really ask your question in general terms to your colleague without breaking confidentiality. Sometimes it can be a very technique-based issue, or you can, blind certain things in certain labels in the figure to make it so that the other person can't, won't know what the exact scientific question is, and you can paraphrase it and get your answer, and that is acceptable to us as well. Another issue is including trainees in the review process, and the JBMR journals are not opposed to this. This can be a very valuable teaching and learning opportunity. There's sort of two different categories here, though. So if you have a senior postdoc or staff scientist who really needs only minimal help to generate the full review, you can ask us to directly invite them. So you would decline the review and provide their name and also the information that they are one of your senior trainees and that you think they would be highly appropriate. That way, these senior people get credit, and we get to add new reviewers into our system, and it's a good way to help people get started in their careers. If you do this, you should still feel free to provide some guidance, let them ask you questions, etc., of course maintaining confidentiality yourself as well as those junior people. If you have someone like a graduate student or a junior postdoc who you want to bring in to help you with the review as a learning experience, that's fine, but the review really remains your responsibility. You should acknowledge their contribution in your confidential remarks to the editors. You can just say, hey, I had a student who helped me with this. Make sure, though, to instruct your trainees about confidentiality. They need to know also that they can't go talking to all sorts of other people about what was in this paper they helped review, and they should also not be using data that they see in the paper directly for their own work. And please also make sure, even if you have someone else draft the review, that you read the paper thoroughly yourself and edit the comments so that they accurately reflect your assessment of the paper. So I think before I get into actually generating your own review, I just want to know if anybody has any questions here. I don't see any in the chat box. Okay, if we don't have any questions, I'll move on to the review itself. So what we're looking for are thorough but concise reviews. We want fair and constructive comments that really get to the essence of the paper, so they can be critical but hopefully impartial. And we want both a scientific appraisal as well as a literary appraisal. So if the paper has great data but is really hard to read, we want to know, and the reviewers can often be very helpful in helping the authors really to, for instance, perhaps reorganize figures in a paper to make it much more understandable to the reader. We want you to think about the quality of the science, how original the work is, and the overall presentation. One aspect that's very important these days is to think about data quality and rigor. So when you submit your review, you have this whole set of questions here that are asking very specific questions to help assess data quality and rigor. JBMR does use a number of guidelines. The ARRIVE guidelines apply to animal studies, and the other ones apply to various types of human studies. So we do ask you to look at that. It's usually in there as a separate PDF document to make sure that they have actually followed the guidelines. And then there are another number of other questions here that should be fairly self-evident to you in terms of how to answer them. But these are important to us that you consider each one of these aspects. The next thing I want to talk about is your main review. And on the JBMR website, this is actually broken down into 3 sections now. The first is overall considerations, which should be about 1 paragraph that summarizes the scope of the study. So what do you see as the results, not simply restating their title. What's the biological or clinical relevance, the adequacy of the approach, the main strengths or weaknesses of the results, the legitimacy of the conclusions, and the potential impact on the field. This is not the place to include your final recommendation. So we have a separate place where your final recommendation should go, and you can discuss this further in your confidential comments to the editors, but we would prefer that you not include a sentence here saying this is acceptable for JBMR or this paper should be rejected. Because when the editors take all reviews as well as their own opinions together, the editors may make a different decision, and it can be confusing for the authors to see these separate things. Then there's another couple of boxes for your detailed review comments, one for major points and the other for minor points. And it's really helpful, especially for the authors when it comes time to respond to these questions, if you can use a numbered list. For the major points, we want you to list and explain the flaws or sometimes the strengths of the paper in terms of the premise and hypothesis, the approach and methods, the strength and credibility of the data, the clarity of text and graphics, the appropriateness of conclusions or models they may have drawn, and the quality of the discussion. In the minor points box should go things like advice on organization, like please take supplementary figure 2 and add it to regular figure 3, or put it as a main figure. If you notice that they call out the wrong figure panel, or you have suggestions for formatting a figure, those are minor points. Please do not list every typo if there are many of them in a paper. If there are just 1 or 2 critical ones, that's fine. But if there are a lot, just simply state that the paper needs editing for grammar, for English, or just overall copy editing. Those things can happen after the paper is accepted and will happen with the JBMR editorial staff. And lastly, while it's often useful to reference a specific figure or panel in your numbered points, you don't need to go through every single figure in your point-by-point review of the paper. As you're reviewing a paper, it's important to be alert to possible ethical issues. And these are of 2 types. One is image manipulation. So there is a possibility to have duplications of images within or between manuscripts. Sometimes people do these with slightly different fields. If you happen to notice this, please do let us know. You can also see evidence of overlapping erasures, changing background areas, changing band detail, etc. And I've listed a website here where you can learn more about these things. But if you notice something, let us know. The second type is plagiarism of text. So the journal does use software to detect this, but sometimes an astute reviewer, perhaps when going back to the literature to put the manuscript at hand in context, you might notice some familiar text, whether it's from the same authors or different ones. And if you see something like this, again, please make a note of it. You do note that the identification of a discrepancy doesn't by itself demonstrate that there is intent to falsify data. There can be times when these are simply duplication errors, and these things can certainly be sorted out. But when in doubt, please avert the editors to any concerns you have about plagiarism or image manipulation. in addition to your narrative review, we have this set of check boxes that discuss the scientific impact and quality of the work. And we do really want to focus papers in JBMR on those that will have a high scientific impact. So we ask you to choose whether this represents a major new advance to the field, a solid contribution, something that corroborates or refutes a controversial topic, or whether it's incremental though relevant, or essentially only reproduction of what is already known. So this is really important to think about, and although this checkbox is at the beginning of the website, I would suggest that it's not something you should really decide on until after you have constructed your full review. And then lastly, we have this box. Again, this comes before your overall review, but is something you should probably think about at the end, is what you put in your confidential comments to the editor and your overall recommendation. So there's no requirement to put anything in this confidential comments to the editor box. So you should not repeat your author comments. Don't simply cut and paste the exact same text that you put to the authors here to the editors. But it is a place that you can summarize the factors leading to your recommendation. That can be really helpful to us, especially when you have a big, long list of things. It's nice if we just have a sentence or two about really how you put it all together, specifically for the editors. If you have any concerns about data integrity, plagiarism, or some conflicts, you should note those here, as well as you can add your trainee acknowledgement. And then we have the different choices for your recommendation. So what should you choose? You should be aware that very few papers are accepted as is after the first review, so don't feel any pressure to say accept the first time around. Most of the really good papers still require some minor revisions, which are primarily issues of clarification, such as adjustments to the figures, addition of details to methods or statistics, or maybe some revisions to the discussion. Whereas extensive revision is used when there are more than minimal additions to experiments that are required to support the conclusions, if there are major reorganization things that need to happen to the paper, or if you're requesting that the authors make significant adjustments to the conclusions that they make based on their data, even if you consider the data to be sound. You should consider rejection if you find serious flaws in the experimental design or results, if you see large experimental gaps between the goals of the study and what was actually accomplished, and if you find data that's not credible, inconsistent, or showing minimal differences with dubious biological or clinical significance. Statements in your overall considerations paragraph should also be very consistent with this choice. So you should really be considering these checkboxes along with that overall considerations paragraph together and make sure that they match. So what do we do once we see these recommendations that you make? You should know that the narrative content of the reviews and the overall impact have strong weight, and in my opinion are more important than your choice of things like reject versus extensive revision. As a reviewer myself, I have often obsessed a bit over which box to check, and sometimes I'm feeling like it's mean to hit reject all the time. You should feel like we are really going to read the narrative of what you say and consider that very carefully and not just look at the checkbox and agree with that. Incremental work may be rejected even if the experiments are comprehensive and properly interpreted in the context of a really well-written manuscript. Conversely, manuscripts that seem to need significant extra experiments may be offered revision if there is perceived to be potential for very high impact on the field. The editors look at the manuscript, but in most cases don't read it at the same level of details as the reviewers. So, your summaries are very helpful, and if you can refer to a particular figure, then it makes it very easy for the editors to go back and say, oh, okay, I see what the issue is in figures 4 and 5, for instance. We do sometimes have cases of big discrepancies among the reviewers, such as an accept minor revision versus a reject. And in these cases, the editors may invite an additional reviewer, or they may sit down and really read the paper very carefully themselves and act essentially as a third reviewer themselves to come to a decision. So those things apply really to all papers, but reviewing revised manuscripts has some distinct features to it that I want to discuss here. So except in extreme circumstances, like you're going to be away from work for a long time, we would really like you to agree to review the revision, even if you had initially suggested reject. You should carefully read the author's response to reviewer's letter. So this is a separate file that's present on the website. Look at how they've changed the manuscript, which should be highlighted at least in the PDF version that's on the website. Sometimes you can't see these things in the HTML version, so be aware of that. And please think about the response to everyone's comments, not just yours. Sometimes somebody brings up a really interesting point that you hadn't caught before, but you may have an opinion on now. Depending on how much time has elapsed between the original submission and the resubmission and how many changes have been made, you may or may not need to carefully read the entire manuscript again, particularly if there are only minor revisions. It is appropriate to really focus your time and efforts on the changes that have been made if you've already carefully read the paper. Whenever possible, you should avoid bringing up entirely new issues with the data or text that was there initially, unless the new additions or revisions cause your concerns. It can be extremely frustrating for authors to be faced with an entirely new set of questions at the stage of the revision, and we would really like to try to avoid that. And one way to avoid that is to try to do a very careful review the first time around. In some cases, a second round of revisions will be requested from the authors, but generally only for minor issues. If there are persistent major problems, generally this leads to rejection of the paper at this stage. Okay, so I do see a couple of questions here, and maybe I'll pause before I spend a few minutes talking about the titles. So I have one question about how to volunteer as a reviewer. While it is true that reviews for an individual paper are by invitation only, the ASBMR on I guess about a yearly basis has put out a call to members for people to volunteer as reviewers, and that just means that you will be added to the website with putting in all of your various expertise, which makes you more likely to be chosen, but it will not assure you of being chosen as a reviewer, because that is based on a case-by-case basis as the manuscripts we receive. So to talk here about the titles, which this does appear on your reviewer score sheet. Readers are attracted by titles. We all do literature searches, and before you even get to the point of looking at the abstract, you're looking at the title. So a clear, simple, captivating title is really important. And although we are working to educate the authors, reviewers can also be an important component of helping the journal to ensure that good papers get read as widely as possible. So we ask you to pause and look specifically at the title. So what is a well-written title? Here's an example. Life expectancy in patients treated for osteoporosis, observational cohort study using national Danish prescription data. So this uses captivating words like life expectancy. It's very succinct. It has the pertinent study information in the title, And the keywords that have been chosen either duplicate or paraphrase the issues that are present in the title. There are two different types of titles. There are indicative titles, which tell what a study is about. These are really usually most effective for review type papers, such as comparison of two drug regimens in prevention of cardiovascular mortality and morphological characterization of skeletal cells in CBFA deficient mice. The more common type of title that you will find in JBMR are informative titles, which tell the results of the study and should include a verb and read like a newspaper headline, such as estrogen reduces the risk of hip fractures in postmenopausal women. Things you want to avoid in a title are too many words, too many acronyms, although occasionally one acronym is better than writing out a really long set of words that are well recognized in the field. You should avoid using inconclusive or ambiguous statements, the passive verb form, and we discourage the use of questions in a title for a research paper. Here is an example of an ineffective title. This is very long, and it is not informative. It says changes to something and their value, but it doesn't say what the value is. Therefore, it's ambiguous. So the alternative title here, changes in C-reactive protein and erythrocyte sedimentation rate predict response to immunosuppressive therapy in rheumatoid arthritis, is a much more direct title. So that's one type of ineffective title you will sometimes see. Another type that you will see is when the authors actually go beyond their conclusions in their title, and that's something else you should keep those things in mind as you think about the title. And just the last few things here, JBMR does offer Publons, which allow you to get credit for your reviews. This is a service that keeps track of what you do, and you can sign up for this and then just check the box on your review. Also, you should know that JBMR does do performance evaluations. They keep track of the number of invitations accepted, the timeliness of the reviews, do you do them within the 14 days allotted or not, and the quality of the reviews, which the associate editors do score as they look at the reviews. High-performing reviewers may be invited to join the editorial board team. Those are 5-year terms. And editorial board members are expected to review about 10 papers per year and to agree to the majority of invitations sent to them. There are further resources to improve review, and those include a new guide for reviewers. There are also resources at the Publons Academy. And lastly, if you review a paper, if you're a new reviewer and you would like to know how you did, you can send an email through the JBMR website to the editors and ask them for feedback on your review. So I do have a couple of questions here, and if anyone else has any, they should please start typing them now. I have one question that says, how do I deal with a manuscript that reports very good work but is poorly written, making it difficult to follow? In those cases, it's fine to suggest extensive revision and to indicate that the poor writing really does it does need to be addressed before the paper is suitable for publication. Sometimes this has to do with usage of English, and there are professional scientific editors out there that can be hired, and sometimes that is required. Sometimes people just need a colleague to sit down and help them to revise a paper, but yeah, we're really, the first thing is the science good? And if there's really good science, then the reviewers, the editors, and the journal itself can help to turn that really good data into a much better manuscript. I have another question about the plagiarism checks and at what level that's done. That is really done at the editorial staff level. So we're not asking the reviewers to specifically do the plagiarism checks themselves, but rather if they have any concerns to just bring them to the editor's attention. I also have questions about how do you sign up for volunteering to review, and I don't actually have the dates. Perhaps Katie knows when the next planned call for volunteers in, but you should get communications through ASBMR.
Hi, Deb. I'm also happy to answer that directly. We do it once a year, usually midsummer, but at any time if you would like to submit to us your interest and your CV, just email the ASBMR office at asbmr@asbmr.org, and we will put you into the system after we take a look at your CV and relevant experience. So that can kind of happen at any time.
Okay. The only other question I see at the moment is, will the slides be available after the presentation? And yes, this whole webinar with the audio as well will get posted on the ASBMR website sometime later today or tomorrow. If there aren't any other questions, I just want to say thank you to everyone who reviews. Really, a good journal cannot remain as a good journal without high quality reviews, and this is really a key and central thing that every journal needs is good reviewers. So thank you very much for your interest in the process.
So we have a couple more questions that are kind of coming in right now. One of those is, do you have to be an ASBMR member to review for JBMR?
No, you do not have to be an ASBMR member. Many times when we choose reviewers by doing online searches for the most appropriate people scientifically, they may not even be in the field, but may have a big interest in a molecule that's just been described or something like that. So definitely you do not need to be a member to review for the journal. There's another question here about can you ask the editor to have the statistics checked if you don't have a statistics background? Definitely, if there's something that you find to be a bit fishy but you're not entirely sure, that's a great thing to bring up in the confidential comments to the editors. And maybe the other reviewer has already addressed it and has some expertise there, but maybe this will prompt the editor to bring on an additional reviewer who can really look at the statistics specifically. So yes, definitely you should bring those things to our attention.
Okay, it looks like that's all for questions. I want to say thank you again so much to Dr. Veis for your time today and all the really helpful advice that you've given to all the participants. And thank you so much to everyone who's joined us for the webinar and for all of the really, really helpful questions. We do have another webinar tomorrow. We hope you'll join us Friday, June 22nd at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for a career development webinar, Tips and Tricks for Landing Your Next Lab Position. This is hosted by Dr. Larry Suva and Dr. Patrick Mulcrone. For recordings of the past webinars and for a list of upcoming webinars, you can visit our website at asbmr.org/SERIES CDWS. And we will also be sending a survey shortly, which we encourage you all to complete. And we ask that you send us your feedback along with any suggestions that you have on future topics and speakers for this webinar series or for the Career Development webinar series. So thank you once again to our presenter, and thank you so much to all of our participants, and have a great week and weekend.